You know what's remarkable about Anne Sexton? She took all the things women weren't supposed to talk about in polite society: mental illness, suicide attempts, sexual desire, the darker sides of motherhood, and turned them into some of the most powerful poetry of the 20th century. In an era when women were expected to suffer in silence, she refused to keep quiet. And in doing so, she didn't just change poetry, she changed how we think about what it means to be honest about the human experience. Anne Gray Harvey was born on the 9th of November, 1928, in Newton, Massachusetts, into the kind of well-to-do New England family that specialized in keeping up appearances. Her father, Ralph Churchill Harvey, was a successful wool merchant, whilst her mother, Mary Gray Staples Harvey, came from old Massachusetts stock. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The big house, the country club memberships, the expectation that Anne would grow up to be a proper wife and mother. But beneath that polished exterior, the Harvey family was struggling with secrets that would haunt Anne for the rest of her life. The family dynamics were toxic in ways that were common, but rarely acknowledged in 1950s America. Her father was an alcoholic who may have been sexually inappropriate with his daughters, though the full extent of abuse in the Harvey household remains unclear. Her mother was emotionally distant, more concerned with social standing than with nurturing her children's emotional needs. Anne learned early that feelings were dangerous things, that vulnerability was weakness, that the price of love was keeping quiet about pain. She followed the prescribed path for young women of her class and generation. She went to finishing school, married young, and started having children. In 1948, she married Alfred K.O. Sexton II, and by 1955, they had 2 daughters, Linda and Joyce. From the outside, Anne seemed to be living the American dream. She was beautiful, married to a successful businessman, living in a comfortable suburban home with 2 healthy children. But inside, she was drowning. The first major breakdown came in 1954, following the birth of her second daughter. What we might now recognize as severe postpartum depression was then simply called a nervous breakdown, and the treatment options were limited and often harmful. Anne was hospitalized, given electroshock therapy, and medicated with drugs that numbed her but didn't heal her. The experience was traumatic, but it also marked the beginning of her journey toward finding her voice as a poet. It was during one of her hospitalizations that a doctor suggested she try writing as a form of therapy. This wasn't uncommon advice. Keeping a journal was often recommended for women struggling with nerves. But for Anne, picking up a pen wasn't just therapeutic, it was revolutionary. She discovered that she could take the chaos in her mind and shape it into something beautiful, something that might matter to other people. Her first attempts at poetry were tentative, almost apologetic. She was, after all, a suburban housewife with no formal training in literature. But she had something that many more educated poets lacked: absolute honesty about experiences that most people tried to hide. When she wrote about depression, it wasn't abstract or metaphorical. It was visceral, immediate, recognizable to anyone who'd ever felt the weight of despair settling over them like a physical thing. The breakthrough came when she started attending poetry workshops led by John Holmes at the Boston Center for Adult Education. Holmes was initially uncomfortable with Anne's subject matter. He felt that poetry should elevate and inspire, not wallow in personal problems. But Anne found allies in other workshop members, particularly Maxine Kumin, who became a lifelong friend and collaborator. These relationships gave her the confidence to pursue her writing seriously. What made Anne's poetry so powerful was how it violated every rule about what women were supposed to write about. While other female poets of the era often focused on nature, domesticity, or abstract emotional states, Anne wrote about masturbation, menstruation, her suicide attempts, her troubled relationship with her children, her sexual fantasies. She refused to sanitize her experience or present herself as a noble sufferer. Instead, she showed readers what it actually felt like to be a woman struggling with mental illness in 1950s America. This wasn't just confessional poetry, it was revolutionary poetry. Anne was essentially saying that women's inner lives, in all their messiness and complexity, were worthy subjects for serious art. She was claiming space for female anger, female sexuality, female ambition in a literary landscape that had traditionally marginalized these experiences. Her work opened doors for countless other women writers who had been told their stories didn't matter. The reception of her work was complex and often contradictory. Critics praised her technical skill and emotional power, while simultaneously dismissing her as too personal, too revealing, too much. This double bind, being celebrated for your honesty whilst being criticized for the same honesty, became a pattern throughout her career. She was winning awards and gaining recognition, but she was also being pathologized and sensationalized in ways that male confessional poets rarely experienced. Her relationship with fame was similarly complicated. On one hand, recognition validated her belief that her experiences mattered, that her voice deserved to be heard. On the other hand, she found herself trapped by the persona she'd created. Audiences expected her to be the tragic, tortured poet, and she felt pressure to perform that role even when she was feeling relatively stable. This dynamic is particularly cruel for someone whose art emerges from authentic emotional experience. Success requires you to commodify your own pain. The subject matter of her poetry evolved as she grew as an artist, but certain themes remained constant. Motherhood was a recurring topic, but not the idealized version that dominated popular culture. Anne wrote about the ambivalence many women feel toward their children, the way motherhood can feel like both blessing and burden. She explored the guilt that comes with not being a natural mother, the fear of passing on your own damage to the next generation. Her treatment of female sexuality was equally groundbreaking. At a time when women were expected to be either pure or fallen, Anne wrote about desire as a complex, sometimes contradictory force. She didn't romanticize sex or present it as simply liberating. Instead, she showed how sexuality could be empowering and destructive, healing and harmful, sometimes simultaneously. This nuanced approach to female desire was virtually unprecedented in mainstream American poetry. Mental illness remained her most consistent theme, but her approach to it evolved over time. Early poems often presented depression and suicidal ideation as dramatic, almost romantic states. Later work became more analytical, more interested in understanding the mechanics of mental illness rather than simply expressing its effects. She began to explore the relationship between creativity and madness, questioning whether her art required her suffering or whether it might actually offer a path toward healing. The technical aspects of her poetry deserve attention too. Anne wasn't just spilling her feelings onto the page, she was crafting them into formal structures that amplified their emotional impact. She understood that raw emotion alone doesn't make for good poetry. You need skill, discipline, and artistic vision to transform personal experience into universal art. Her best work demonstrates mastery of traditional forms, while maintaining the immediacy and authenticity that made her voice so distinctive. Her influence on other writers, particularly women writers, cannot be overstated. Poets like Sylvia Plath, Adrienne Rich, and Sharon Olds have all acknowledged Anne's importance in showing them that their own experiences could be legitimate subjects for poetry. She proved that you didn't have to write like a man to be taken seriously as a poet, that female perspectives could be both personal and universal, both intimate and important. But the cost of this pioneering work was enormous. Anne's mental health struggles continued throughout her career, exacerbated by the pressure of public attention and the exhaustion of constantly mining her own trauma for artistic material. She attempted suicide multiple times, was repeatedly hospitalized, and struggled with alcoholism and prescription drug addiction. The very honesty that made her poetry so powerful also made her life increasingly difficult to sustain. The relationship between her art and her illness became a central question in discussions of her work. Some critics argued that her mental illness was essential to her creativity, that recovery would somehow diminish her artistic power. This perspective, while meant to be sympathetic, was actually deeply harmful. It suggested that Anne's value as a person was tied to her suffering, that she had to choose between wellness and artistic relevance. Anne herself seemed torn about this question. In interviews, she sometimes embraced the tortured artist persona, suggesting that her pain was the source of her poetry. Other times, she expressed a desire to find ways of writing that didn't require constant psychological excavation. This ambivalence reflects a broader cultural problem: our tendency to romanticize mental illness in artists, whilst failing to provide them with adequate support and understanding. Her final years were marked by increasing isolation and despair. Despite professional success, she'd won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1967, she felt increasingly disconnected from life. The gap between her public persona as a successful poet and her private experience of persistent mental anguish became unbearable. Friends and family noticed that she seemed to be withdrawing from the activities and relationships that had previously sustained her. On the 4th of October 1974, Anne Sexton died by suicide in her garage, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. She was 45 years old. Her death was both shocking and somehow inevitable. She'd written so openly about her suicidal thoughts that it seemed almost like a promise she'd made to her readers. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of an individual life, but the loss of a voice that had been speaking for so many other women who felt silenced by their own struggles. The aftermath of her death sparked important conversations about the relationship between mental health and creativity, about the responsibility of the literary community to support struggling artists, about the ethics of encouraging confessional writing without providing adequate psychological support. These discussions continue today as we grapple with similar questions about contemporary artists who use their platform to discuss mental health challenges. What makes Anne's legacy particularly complex is how her work has been both celebrated and misunderstood. She's often reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of confessional poetry, or romanticized as a tragic figure whose suffering produced beautiful art. Both of these interpretations miss the point of what she actually accomplished. Anne Sexton wasn't just documenting her pain, she was transforming it into something that could help other people feel less alone in their own struggles. Her influence extends far beyond poetry. She helped create space in American culture for honest discussions about mental health, particularly women's mental health. Before Anne, depression was something to be hidden, suicide was unmentionable, and women's anger was seen as unseemly. Her work began to change these attitudes, showing that these experiences were part of the human condition rather than personal failures to be ashamed of. In our current moment, when mental health awareness has become mainstream and confessional writing dominates social media, Anne's example feels both prescient and cautionary. She showed us the power of radical honesty about psychological struggle, but she also demonstrated the costs of turning your private pain into public art without adequate support systems in place. What we can learn from Anne Sexton today is not that suffering is necessary for art, but that honesty about suffering can be transformative, both for the artist and for the audience. She proved that poetry could be a vehicle for exploring the most difficult aspects of human experience, that women's stories deserve to be told with the same seriousness and complexity as men's stories, that mental illness didn't disqualify someone from creating meaningful art. Her work reminds us that healing is possible even when it's not complete, that creativity can coexist with mental illness without being caused by it, that speaking truthfully about pain can be an act of courage rather than self-indulgence. These lessons feel more relevant than ever in our current era of mental health awareness and social media confession. Perhaps most importantly, Anne Sexton showed us that it's possible to transform personal darkness into something that illuminates the path for others. Her poems continue to speak to people struggling with depression, with the challenges of womanhood, with the basic human difficulty of staying alive in a world that can feel overwhelming and hostile. That's the real measure of her success. Not the awards or the critical recognition, but the countless readers who have found solace and understanding in her refusal to suffer in silence. Every time someone speaks honestly about their mental health struggles, every time a woman refuses to apologize for her complexity, every time an artist chooses authenticity over acceptability, Anne Sexton's legacy continues. And in a world that still struggles to understand and support people dealing with mental illness, that legacy remains as necessary as ever. That is it for today. You've been listening to The Guide on the Side, where I share what I'm learning from people, books, and conversations. I hope something here stays with you, sparks a thought, or opens a door. I'm Ivan, and I'll be back soon with more. Until next time, may your days be full of curiosity, and I'll see you in the next episode.